The arena's crystalline dome stretched like an impossible sky, its multifaceted surface refracting light into 1,000 brutal rainbows. Marcus Chen knew he was going to die, not with a heroic last stand, not in a blaze of glory, but in total, abject humiliation. Gravity chains pulled at his limbs, each step a battle against technology designed to crush his spirit before the real punishment began. The Krelltak Arena was a monument to pain, a coliseum that had consumed thousands of species, reducing them to nothing more than footnotes in the grand bloodsport of the Dominion. Zartha, the reigning champion, towered at the center of the arena. Her exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, each segment a razor-sharp piece of biological armor that told stories of 1,000 conquered worlds. Multiple eyes, some biological, some cybernetic, fixed on Marcus with a predatory intensity that made human skin seem impossibly fragile. Another human, Xartha's voice boomed, translated through universal communication implants, brought to die for our entertainment. The crowd roared. 15,000 alien species, packed into tiered seating that spiraled upward like a cancerous growth, erupted in anticipation. Bet markers flickered across holographic displays, odds calculating Marcus's probable survival time in microseconds. Behind him, Marcus knew what was at stake. The colony. 200,000 humans, trapped on a resource-depleted mining world, their survival contingent on this moment. One victory, or at least a performance impressive enough to secure their continued existence as a registered species under Dominion law. Zartha laughed. It was a sound that defied translation, part mechanical screech, part biological rumble that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. "Look at it," she announced to the crowd. "So small, so fragile." Marcus remembered his grandmother's words, not the soft platitudes of most human elders, but the hard-learned lessons of survival. In the universe, she told him, never show fear. Fear is a weapon they'll use to destroy you before the first blow lands. The gravity chains suddenly intensified. Marcus felt his knees buckle, but something inside him refused to break. His eyes, dark, unreadable, remained locked on Xartha. A ripple passed through the crowd. Something was different. In the uppermost tier, barely noticed by most, an ancient figure watched. Thax, once the most feared strategist in Dominion history, now in exile. Pale membrane skin stretched over brittle bones, eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, and those eyes were fixed not on Kakov, but on Marcus. "Interesting," Cathax murmured, so softly that no translation matrix could capture the nuance. Zartha approached, each step a display of biological perfection. Muscle groups that humans couldn't comprehend, reflexes enhanced beyond organic limitation, a body engineered for 1,000 types of combat. Her primary weapon, a molecular disruptor blade, hummed with potential energy. "Shall we see how long a human can last?" she announced. The first strike was going to be a statement, not just a blow, but a declaration of species superiority. Zartha moved with impossible speed, a blur that human eyes could barely track. Marcus did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a desperate smile, not a mad smile, but the kind of smile that suggested he knew something nobody else did. In that moment, everything paused. The bet markers flickered. The crowd's roar became a confused murmur. Even Xartha's movements seemed to hesitate, a microsecond of uncertainty. Thax leaned forward. Something was very, very wrong with this human. Darkness. Then a sudden, violent burst of light. Marcus awoke suspended in a zero-gravity chamber, neural interfaces already probing the limits of his consciousness. This was no ordinary holding cell. It was a tactical preparation zone that defied every known protocol of prisoner management. Thax sat, or rather, integrated, with a complex biomechanical interface that seemed more living organism than machine. The ancient strategist's form was a nightmare of biological engineering. Half organic, half technological, with membrane-like skin that shifted and pulsed with internal rhythms. "You survived the initial scan," Cathax remarked. Not a question, but a statement of clinical observation. "Most would have been mentally fractured by now." Marcus said nothing. His grandmother had taught him that silence was a weapon, information a currency more valuable than any physical resource. The chamber around them began to transform. Holographic simulations erupted. Battlefield scenarios that merged quantum probability calculations with visceral combat simulations. Each projection lasted microseconds, presenting Marcus with impossible tactical challenges that would have overwhelmed a standard neural network. "The Dominion believes in absolute optimization," Cathax explained, his voice a curious blend of mechanical translation and organic undertones. "Perfection through elimination, strength through ruthless selection. But they've forgotten the most crucial element of survival." A pause. Marcus knew the question was coming. "Adaptation," Cathax continued, "is not about being the strongest. It's about being the most unpredictable." The holographic scenarios shifted. Marcus watched as his own movements were analyzed, deconstructed, rebuilt. Neural interfaces mapped potential response patterns, tracking microsecond variations in reaction time, identifying gaps in his physical and mental capabilities. But something else was happening. With each simulation, Marcus wasn't just responding, he was learning. His brain was reconfiguring itself, finding patterns within the chaos, creating solutions that defied standard combat algorithms. Cathax's multiple optical receptors narrowed. Interesting. A sudden alarm. The chamber's defensive systems activated, holographic weapons materializing from impossible angles. This was no longer a training simulation. This was a live threat assessment. Marcus moved. Not with the calculated precision of a trained fighter. Not with the brute force of a gladiatorial champion. But with a fluid, almost improvisational grace that seemed to bend the very rules of combat physics. He wasn't fighting the holographic threats. He was dancing with them. Cathax's neural interfaces went into overdrive, tracking data streams that would have overwhelmed most computational systems. Marcus wasn't just responding to threats. He was predicting them, creating micro-narratives of potential conflict that allowed him to be 3 steps ahead of any possible attack. "Your species," Cathax murmured, "is an anomaly." The training continued. Hours became days, or what passed for days in this timeless preparation zone. Marcus's body was being rebuilt, not through standard enhancement protocols, but through a radical deconstruction of physical and mental limitations. Cathax revealed fragments of a larger story. The Dominion's gladiatorial system was more than entertainment. It was a method of galactic population control, a way of managing potentially threatening species by turning their strongest into spectacle and eventual sacrifice. "You are not just preparing to fight Akhtartha," Cathax said during one particularly intense neural recalibration. "You are preparing to challenge an entire system of galactic oppression." Marcus finally spoke. 2 words that made Cathax's complex biological systems pause. "Tell me." The chamber went silent, but it was the silence of a predator taking a breath before the hunt. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. The Dominion's central administrative hub pulsed with a cold, mechanical heartbeat. Quantum data streams cascaded through bioarchitectural corridors that defied traditional understanding of space and geometry. Here, power wasn't measured in physical currency, but in calculated probabilities of control. Director Vexnera reviewed the latest gladiatorial performance metrics, her neural implants parsing millions of data points simultaneously. Humans were an anomaly, unpredictable, adaptive, dangerous. The gladiatorial system wasn't just entertainment. It was population management. Culling. Control. A priority communication blinked. Encrypted. From Cathax. Most would have dismissed it immediately. Cathax was an exile, a strategist who had fallen from grace decades ago. But Vexnera knew better. Exiles often saw what those in power chose to ignore. The message was elegant in its complexity. Not words, but a quantum-encrypted data pattern that would dissolve milliseconds after interpretation. It spoke of Marcus Chen, not as a potential gladiator, but as something more, a variable. In the lowest levels of the arena complex, true power moved in shadows. The broker, a being of such complex biological and technological hybridization that its very existence challenged conventional understanding, monitored multiple streams of potential outcomes. Betting pools weren't just about individual matches. They were elaborate predictive models that shaped galactic economic and political landscapes. Interesting, the broker murmured, multiple sensory clusters focusing on a holographic representation of Marcus Chen. Back in the training facility, Marcus experienced a different kind of revelation. HFY had been systematically exposing the underlying structures of the Dominion's gladiatorial system. It wasn't random. It was a carefully constructed mechanism of control. Every species has a breaking point, HFY explained, neural interfaces projecting complex holographic simulations. The Dominion identifies that point and uses it as a method of population management. The simulations were brutal. Entire civilizations reduced to statistical models. Gladiatorial contests weren't just about individual combat. They were calculated methods of societal suppression. Marcus watched as holographic representations of different species flickered, each one showing their eventual extinction through the gladiatorial system. Humans were just the latest potential target. "Why tell me this?" Marcus asked. HFY's response was typical, oblique, layered with meaning. "Because you are not just a participant. You are a potential disruption, a sudden alarm." The training chamber's defensive systems activated with violent precision. This was no routine drill. Someone, or something, was attempting to infiltrate their secure location. The attack came from multiple vectors. Quantum-phased assassination protocols that could dissolve organic matter at the molecular level. Precision attacks designed to eliminate threats before they could even comprehend the nature of the attack. Marcus moved. Not with traditional combat training. Not with the predictable responses the attackers would expect. He moved with a fluidity that suggested he was reading the very probability streams of the attack. HFY observed neural interfaces recording every microsecond of the response. This was more than training. This was evolution in real time. The attackers, biomechanical constructs designed for absolute elimination, found themselves facing something they couldn't calculate. Marcus wasn't just defending. He was rewriting the very algorithms of conflict. 3 attackers entered. None would leave. As the last construct dissolved into molecular fragments, HFY made a decision. The communication to Director Vexnera would be sent, not as a warning, but as a declaration. The game was changing. And humanity was no longer just a playing piece. A single message accompanied the data stream. Prepare. The undercircuit gleamed like an infected wound. A series of gladiatorial arenas that existed between official Dominion records. Here, species were nothing more than statistical probabilities, fighters reduced to raw data points waiting to be consumed or discarded. Marcus entered not as a conquering hero, but as something far more dangerous, an unknown variable. His first match was against a Korak berserker, a species bred for nothing but pure, unbridled violence. Genetically engineered muscles rippled beneath translucent skin that could regenerate faster than most weapons could cause damage. Standard combat algorithms gave the Korak a 99.7% probability of victory. No one told the Korak about the 0.3%. The arena was a fractal nightmare of shifting gravitational fields and molecular disruptor energy barriers. Weapons that could slice through battleship hulls were standard equipment. Survival was a mathematical impossibility. Marcus moved differently. Not with the calculated precision of a trained fighter. Not with the brute force of a standard gladiator. His movement was a language of its own. Each step a complex algorithm. Each gesture a probabilistic prediction of conflict. The Korak charged. A standard attack would have been suicide. But Marcus didn't defend. He danced. Quantum-linked neural interfaces that Cathax had integrated into his training allowed Marcus to perceive combat dimensions most species couldn't comprehend. He wasn't fighting the Korak. He was reading its entire genetic and behavioral probability stream. 3 minutes. That's all it took. The Korak lay defeated, its regenerative capabilities overwhelmed by a form of combat that defied biological programming. In the observation levels, something stirred. The broker's multiple sensory clusters recalibrated. Betting pools across the Dominion began to shift. Microsecond by microsecond, the impossible was becoming probable. Marcus's victories weren't just wins. They were statements. Each match revealed another layer of the system. The Undercircuit wasn't just a fighting arena. It was a complex ecosystem of control. Species were filtered, their potential for resistance measured and neutralized. But Marcus was rewriting the equations. His fifth match came against a neural-linked combat construct, a living weapon designed to adapt in real time. Thousands of computational matrices predicted its movements hundreds of times per second. It was perfection incarnate. Marcus didn't fight it. He conversed with it. Not with words, with probability streams, with the very language of conflict itself. The construct froze. Its neural matrices, designed for absolute combat optimization, encountered something it couldn't process. A fighter who was more than a fighter, a human who was reading the very code of conflict. Defeat. But something else was happening. With each victory, Marcus was collecting more than just wins. He was gathering data, understanding the system from within. Cathax watched from a remote surveillance point, neural interfaces parsing every microsecond of the performance. Interesting, the exile murmured. But there was something else in that statement. Something that suggested this was far more than just another gladiatorial run. A priority communication blinked. Encrypted, from deep within the Dominion's most secure communication networks. Sartho was watching. And for the first time, something that might have been fear flickered through her multiple optical receptors. The bet markers across the galaxy began to shift. Slowly at first, then with increasing velocity. Humanity was no longer just a participant. It was becoming a threat. Pain was a language Marcus had become fluent in. The medical reconstruction chamber was nothing like standard Dominion healing facilities. Cathax had constructed something else entirely, a fusion of technologies that blurred the lines between repair and reinvention. Nano-regenerative matrices wove through Marcus's damaged tissues, but they were doing more than simple healing. They were rewriting his very biological potential. Healing is a failure of imagination, Cathax murmured, adjusting quantum-linked neural interfaces that pulsed with impossible complexity. Humans are the only species that sees injury as an opportunity for redesign. Marcus's body was a battlefield of transformation. Each damaged cell became a point of potential, each broken system a chance for radical reimagining. The Dominion's medical protocols were about restoration. This was something else entirely. Deep within the chamber's quantum-entangled systems, something extraordinary was happening. Marcus wasn't just recovering. He was evolving. Fragments of memory surfaced. His grandmother's lessons, not just survival techniques, but something deeper, a philosophy of adaptation that transcended traditional understanding of biological limitation. The universe doesn't care about your potential, she told him. It cares about your ability to change the equation. Cathax's complex sensory systems detected the transformation, biological markers that defied standard computational models. Marcus was developing something beyond enhanced physiology, a form of adaptive intelligence that merged physical capability with predictive consciousness. The broker's remote surveillance systems began to overheat. This wasn't just healing. This was a fundamental reimagining of human potential. Quantum probability streams began to shift. Betting pools across multiple star systems recalibrated. Something was happening that no predictive model could fully comprehend. A priority communication arrived. Encrypted, from the deepest levels of Dominion intelligence. Pexartha was no longer just concerned. She was preparing. The medical chamber's interfaces revealed layers of transformation, neurological pathways reconfiguring, cellular structures developing quantum adaptive capabilities, sensory systems expanding beyond known biological limitations. Marcus opened his eyes, but they weren't the same eyes that had entered the arena months ago. Kithax's multiple optical receptors focused with intense precision. "Interesting," the exile murmured, a phrase that had become a signature of growing anticipation. Outside the chamber, political machinations were already in motion. Director Vexnera reviewed the latest data streams, multiple neural interfaces parsing information at speeds that would destroy standard computational systems. Humanity was no longer just a species to be managed. It was becoming a variable that could rewrite entire galactic equations. The recovery wasn't just physical. It was a statement of potential. Marcus stood. The chamber's quantum fields rippled around him, reality itself seeming to adjust to his presence. "Ready," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of war. In the deepest levels of Dominion control, something fundamental was about to change. The bet markers continued to shift. Probability streams began to collapse. Marcus Chen was no longer just a gladiator. He was becoming something else entirely. The Grand Arena was more than a fighting space. It was a quantum probability nexus, a mathematical cathedral where galactic destinies were calculated and consumed. 15 trillion beings watched through neural-linked broadcasts. This was no longer just a fight. This was a referendum on species potential. Marcus entered. Kazartha was no longer just a gladiator. She was a living weapon. Generations of biological optimization, cybernetic enhancement, and tactical programming compressed into a single, perfect killing form. Her exoskeleton pulsed with molecular disruptor capabilities that could liquefy most organic matter in microseconds. Neural interfaces predicted and countered potential attack vectors faster than most species could comprehend thought. But Marcus wasn't most species. Thax watched from a remote observation point, neural interfaces parsing every potential outcome. The exile had become something more than a mentor, a catalyst, an architect of possibility. The arena's quantum fields began to destabilize. Reality itself seemed uncertain how to process what was about to happen. Avartha attacked first, not with brute force, but with a mathematically perfect assault that had eliminated thousands of species before. Each movement was a complex algorithm of destruction, predicted outcomes calculated across millions of potential conflict scenarios. Marcus didn't block. He didn't dodge. He listened, not with ears, with something deeper. A quantum adaptive consciousness that read conflict as a language, not a physical exchange. Vizartha's primary weapon, a molecular disruptor blade that could slice through battleship hulls, passed through the space where Marcus had been. But Marcus wasn't gone. He was everywhere and nowhere. The betting pools across the galaxy went into quantum shock. This wasn't combat. This was a conversation being held in the language of conflict itself. Zartha's neural interfaces began to fragment. For the first time in her genetically engineered existence, she encountered something outside her predictive models. A human who didn't fight. A human who understood. Fragments of Exartha's true history began to surface. She wasn't just a gladiator. She was a product, a living weapon created to maintain the Dominion's complex system of population control. Marcus saw her, not as an enemy, but as another victim of a system designed to consume potential. Their fight became something else, a deconstruction of the very mechanisms of conflict. Quantum probability streams collapsed. Betting markers imploded. The entire gladiatorial system's predictive infrastructure began to break down. Director Vexnera watched in horror. This was more than a match. This was an existential threat. Kithax's final instruction echoed in Marcus's consciousness. Understand the system to transform it. The molecular disruptor blade descended. Marcus didn't move. But the blade changed its trajectory. Not by Marcus's physical intervention, but by the very language of conflict being rewritten. Xartha stood frozen. Her entire existence, generations of biological and technological optimization, encountered something impossible. A fighter who didn't fight. A human who transformed conflict itself. The arena went silent. 15 trillion neural interfaces simultaneously experienced a moment of absolute uncertainty. Marcus looked at Xartha, not with triumph, not with hatred, with understanding. "We're more than what they made us," he said. And in that moment, everything changed. The Dominion's central control matrix began to fracture millisecond by millisecond. What had seemed like a simple gladiatorial match was revealing itself as something far more profound, a fundamental disruption of galactic control mechanisms that had existed for millennia. Director Vexnera watched in horror as computational systems, designed to predict and control entire species, began to unravel. Marcus Chen wasn't just a fighter. He was a living algorithm of systemic deconstruction. Quantum communication networks across 17 star systems began to transmit fragments of the match, not as a recording, but as a living, evolving narrative that rewrote itself with each transmission. Facts observed from a quantum-shielded observation point, multiple sensory clusters parsing the unfolding transformation. "Interesting," the exile murmured, a phrase that had become a prophecy of fundamental change. The collapse wasn't just political. It was philosophical. Entire species began to recognize something fundamental. The gladiatorial system wasn't just a method of entertainment or population control. It was a complex mechanism of psychological suppression. Marcus had done something impossible. He had transformed conflict into understanding. Xartha, once the perfect weapon of the Dominion, began to broadcast her own experiences. Neural interfaces that were designed to control now became conduits of revelation. The very technology meant to suppress became a tool of liberation. Political structures across multiple star systems began to recalibrate. Species that had been managed and controlled for generations suddenly found themselves with a new perspective. The broker, that complex entity of probabilistic intelligence, recognized the true nature of the transformation. This wasn't just a change. This was an evolutionary leap. Fragments of communication began to surface. "We are more than what they made us." Conflict is a language of misunderstanding. Potential cannot be controlled. It can only be recognized. Marcus found himself at the center of a transformation he hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't a conqueror. He was a translator, converting the language of oppression into a dialogue of potential. Facts approached, the exile's complex biological systems moving with a grace that defied traditional understanding. "You've done more than win a match," the strategist said. "You've rewritten the fundamental equation of galactic interaction." Political entities that had existed for millennia began to crumble, not through violence, not through traditional warfare, but through a fundamental reimagining of possibility. The human colony, those 200,000 souls whose survival had initiated this journey, watched as their representative transformed from a potential sacrificial participant to a catalyst of galactic change. Director Vexnera's neural interfaces captured the most terrifying revelation. Humanity was no longer a species to be managed. It was becoming a species that managed possibility itself. Betting pools across the galaxy collapsed. Predictive models shattered. Entire computational systems designed to control and predict began to recognize their own limitations. Marcus stood at the center of this transformation, not as a hero, not as a conqueror, but as a translator of potential. The universe watched and began to understand. 3 years after the match that changed everything, the universe looked different. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Quantum Concordance, a diplomatic station that had become the new center of galactic interaction. It was neither human nor alien, but something entirely new, a living testament to the possibility of understanding. Facts approached, the exile's complex biological systems now integrated into the station's core infrastructure. "You realize this was never about a single match," the strategist said. "Not a question. A reflection. The gladiatorial system was gone. In its place, a new method of interspecies communication had emerged, not through combat, but through shared potential. Zartha, once the perfect weapon of the Dominion, now served as a primary architect of the quantum concordance. Her transformation was complete, from a tool of suppression to a bridge of understanding. Holographic displays showed the unprecedented changes. 17 previously isolated species now engaged in collaborative research. Entire economic systems reimagined. A galactic framework that valued potential over control. Director Vexnera, no longer a controller, but a facilitator, presented the latest breakthrough. The communication matrix that allowed species to truly understand each other's fundamental experiences. We were wrong, Vexnera admitted. The words carried the weight of millennia of systemic failure. Potential cannot be measured. It can only be recognized. Marcus remembered his grandmother's lessons, not the combat techniques, not the survival strategies, but the deeper truth she had always known. Understanding is the most powerful weapon. The human colony that had once been on the brink of extinction now stood as a center of galactic innovation, not through technological superiority, but through a unique ability to see potential where others saw limitation. Kithax's neural interfaces parsed the moment. You transformed a system by refusing to accept its fundamental premise, the strategist observed. Conflict is not about winning. It's about understanding. Quantum communication networks continued to evolve. What had begun as a single match was now a fundamental reimagining of galactic interaction. The broker, that complex entity of probabilistic intelligence, had become something else entirely. No longer a predictor of outcomes, but a facilitator of possibilities. Marcus looked out at the stars. They were different now. No longer a battlefield. No longer a place of conquest. A place of potential. Gartha approached, her once perfect weapon systems now integrated into diplomatic interfaces. We were wrong, she said, echoing Vexnera's earlier admission. About everything. The station pulsed with a new kind of energy. Not the cold calculation of the Dominion. Something warmer. Something more alive. What now? Marcus asked. Kithax's response was characteristic in its complexity. Now, the strategist said, we begin to understand. The universe watched. And for the first time in millennia, it was listening.